So my name is Ayala Laub, as you know, because we've known each other now for a while. And I'm the director of the Shira Pransky project. And we're a nonprofit, and we're focused in making healthcare accessible to Olim. And so I'm coming tonight kind of talking about supplemental insurance. And of course, I wanted to ask you from your end, and then I'll obviously let you introduce yourself about private insurance. So
I'm Ronen Goldman. I've been working at Goldfuss Insurance since 2012, so quite a long time now, almost 10 years. And basically, we're as largest English-speaking insurance agency in the country. We deal with everything from car and home and health and life and everything under that. So obviously the focus here is on the health insurance. So the health insurance basically is what we'll address from the private insurance perspective, and that's where we're coming from.
Yeah, great. So I guess the first thing that I always want to know, because we get this question a lot, is really what would you identify as the main differences between supplemental insurance and private insurance? Because, people come to us, and obviously I'm coming from the perspective of wanting people to do their best within the system as they can. Of course, obviously, I certainly recommend people look into private insurance. But typically, if someone asks me, which should I get or do I need both, my tendency is to say, well, supplemental insurance has a ton of benefits. You get dental, you get private reimbursement for a specialist, you get a pregnancy package, all of those things. But people still want to know if it's worthwhile to look into private insurance or where that would step in, either, in addition to supplemental insurance, or saying I'm going to actually spend my money on private insurance and not even bother with the Coupa supplemental insurance.
Right. So it's actually funny because I have the reverse conversation. A lot of people speak to me and they say, okay, so you've got the private health insurance. If I take the private health insurance, does it mean that I can now cancel my supplemental insurance with the Coupa?
Right.
So it's funny that it comes from the same question, but from different perspectives.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, I mean, and correct me if I'm wrong, from my understanding of the Coupat Cholim, you've got everything under the sun there that would be covered, except for the things that aren't covered by the Coupa. And that's basically where the private insurance comes in. The idea is that it fills the gaps where the Coupat Cholim falls short. So if that's on medicines outside of the government health basket, then that's a solution. If that is transplants coverage that is outside of the government system, that's the other solution. Surgeries in Israel on a private basis, where their regulation dictates that there are two types of private health policies on the surgeries. One is making up the difference of what the Coupat Cholim doesn't cover. The other one is going completely private, and it gives the consumer the option to choose. So the private policy doesn't replace the supplementary insurance of the Coupat Cholim, but rather it is in addition to, and it fills those gaps. And I think you'll agree with me that in some elements there may be elements of overlap. So consultations with specialist pregnancy packages.
Yeah.
But for the most part, the essence of the private health policy is to fill the gaps where the Coupat Cholim falls short. So I don't think it's a replacement too.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah. I mean, I guess the area where I find that there's the most overlap, and again, you're the expert in private insurance, is certainly when it comes to things like ambulatory care. And I know from our perspective, in that way, I feel that supplemental insurance kind of wins out slightly because, of course, with supplemental insurance through the Coupa, you can't be denied for pre-existing conditions. So I find with there's a lot of overlap, but you can talk about this more also. Things, what we call catastrophe insurance, certainly is not an overlap with supplemental insurance. But I think it's just important, at least for me, to point out that I find that there is a significant amount of overlap when it comes specifically to ambulatory care, and that sometimes if you have supplemental insurance, it doesn't feel necessary to necessarily have both. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think at the end of the day, when it comes to the ambulatory coverage, and just to explain to the listeners who don't understand what ambulatory coverage is, it's basically a rider on the private policy, which covers consultations with specialists on a private basis, diagnostic testing on a private basis, physiotherapy treatments, pregnancy packages, as you mentioned. Every company has different variations of it. But you're right that there might be an element of overlap. My perspective of it is, again, it's in addition to. So yes, you would have, is it how many consultations can you have with the Kupat Cholim a year?
So it depends if you're on the highest level of insurance, because obviously, for anyone who doesn't know, there are two levels of supplemental insurance. If you're on the highest level, some Kupot it's 4. I think Maccabi is still 3 for the highest level, but it's usually between 3 and 4, depends on the Kupa.
Right. So that's where the private policy might kick in and be an overlap. It's not an overlap, but an extension to that. The idea behind that is that the extension. Oh, my kids are crying.
It's all good. Mine, you just can't hear. They're too far away. It's all good.
Right. This is the fun of doing these Zooms over, when kids are at home.
Yeah.
Basically, the extended cover of the ambulatory coverage is that where the Kupat Cholim falls short on the 3 consultations or 4 consultations, the private policies can either give you X amount of consultations. So you've got different companies that might give you 2 or 4 or whatever. But then you have some companies that will give you a budget of, let's say, 11,000 shekel. And then you fit in as many consultations into there as fit. Okay.
Right.
Now, that could be that if somebody, it's very rare, I think, that people will need more than 3 or 4 consultations a year.
Right.
But if and when it happens, then you know that you've got that backup as well through the private policy. Is it true, though, that the Kupat Cholim will only cover doctors on the participating list?
Yeah, so that's a major thing also, and I was going to ask you about that because certainly through the Kupa, I mean, the list is pretty expansive, but definitely each Kupa has a list of people they work with, and if that person's not on the list, you can always attempt to apply to get them on the list based on the credentials, but we know how those things work. It ends up being kind of problematic and doesn't work. I usually find that the list is expansive enough that usually most people can find someone that they're looking for, but we certainly have had cases when someone has come to us and said, I'm on this Kupa, this is the absolute only cardiologist I want to go to, and they're saying they won't cover it, and it's like, well, yeah, he's not on the list, in Malaso,
Right. So that's another solution that the private policy will cover, because there you're not dependent on a participating list of doctors for a consultation. Surgeries, yes.
Right.
There, under the new regulation, there is that necessity to choose a participating surgeon. But on a consultation, you can choose from anyone. Now, there are deductibles, of course. So then you've got to weigh up, is it worth it on this consultation, on that consultation? It can also supplement a consultation through the Kupat Cholim. So let's say you go to your Kupat Cholim and you have to pay out X amount of shekel because that's what the Kupat Cholim covered and they didn't cover everything.
Right.
And often you can turn to your private policy and see if they'll be willing to make up the difference of what you actually paid out. More often than not.
Something like that, let's say with the supplemental plan. So typically how it works is they'll reimburse up to 80% or up to around 660 shekel on the highest plan. So let's say I went to a specialist for 800 shekel and I got 660 shekel back. In theory, my private insurance would cover the remaining 140 shekel.
It's possible that then you have to bring all the paperwork to show what the Kupat Cholim covered. There's a lot of bureaucracy involved to be able to get that.
Right.
When I say a lot, as in for the average person, for us, it's just insurance. But,
Right.
but at the end of the day, there's paperwork involved to bring it along and to see whether or not the insurance company will be willing to accept that instance, etc. And the same thing is true, by the way, for other types of riders as well. So, if you've got on the private policies a children's package, right?
Yeah.
So you've got the Kupat Cholim will give you, let's say, horse riding therapy, right?
Yeah.
And they'll give you either X amount of sessions, one way or another. The private policy can also be a solution to make up the difference of what the Kupat Cholim didn't cover, right? So if you're paying X amount, that's another avenue where there's another rider on the policy that can complement the supplementary insurance too.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. Are there things with private insurance that, let's say, require referrals? Because let's say on supplemental insurance, there are certain things like if I want to go to a private specialist with my supplemental insurance, as long as they're on the list, no one's asking me for anything. It's actually a really simple process. You go to the specialist, you bring the paper in, and then within a month, typically the money is just in your bank account,
Right.
with all the receipts and stuff. But let's say for the example you just brought up about the horseback riding. So each coupa kind of does it differently. And I know that on certain coupons, I know myself as a parent of young children and other people were kind of like, well, we have this, but by the time I, get the pediatrician and the psychologist and all these things to write it off, like, does it really make a difference that I'm saving the 100 shekel on
Right.
the, thing? So is that something that, is easier in private insurance, or is it dependent on the situation?
It really depends. So, for example, if it's a consultation with a specialist, if you don't have a hafnaya from your GP, which we always recommend that you get because it makes the process easier.
Right, we do too, yeah.
Right? But if you end up going for a private consultation and you don't have that, then often what will happen is that we'll ask for the report, the sikum pkisha, the sikum itiatsu. The idea being that we have to show that there's a medical need. It can't be that if Dr. Ayala is a friend of mine and I want to help her out with 1,000 shekel of a consultation, then I'll just go. Right. There's got to be a medical need, and it's got to be proven that there is some sort of reason for going. Similarly as well with the horse riding therapy and the children package. So in that scenario, some insurance companies will demand a letter from a specialist who deals with child development, to show that type of treatment, that type of tipul is necessary for that child, because otherwise it's just a paid chug, right?
Right. Well, that's how the coupa feels also. They kind of got to the point where they're like, why are we paying for all these kids to just hang out with dogs and horses? So, yeah.
And that's just it. So the insurance companies will do the same thing in the sense of, is it just a family doctor who's just extending it? Is it a real hafnaya? Will they accept it, or has it been agreed to by a specialist in the field who will determine whether or not they actually are, that treatment is actually necessary? And, some treatments are going to be covered and some treatments weren't. So horse riding therapy is one that would be covered. Art therapy would be covered. Animal therapy, not necessarily. Is it different than horse riding therapy? And again, it depends on the age of your policy as well, because my kids have a policy from before the regulation came in 2016, where that policy was a different policy. Today's policies have a different definition of what's covered and what the requirements are. So it's just a matter of, this is where obviously you need to have somebody who understands the policies, right? An agent who will be able to look at what policies you've got and determine whether or not the insurance company declining it is justified or not. Right? Because a lot of the times they won't. And that's where you guys come in with the Kupat Cholim. It's possible that the Kupat Cholim is saying, sorry, it's not going to be covered. And you guys can say, hang on, Kupat Cholim, you guys know this isn't right.
Yeah.
You just don't want to pay. Right?
Yeah. No, so that's definitely where we come in with the Kupot. I'm sure we both have endless stories of someone who came to us that they didn't get covered and they spoke to us and it was covered. But yeah, certainly, we tell everyone who's asking about private insurance, and that's why I'm happy to be speaking to you, and specifically with Goldfuss also, is that you need to be able to communicate with your private insurance agent. And I know that a lot of people who have contacted us, sometimes try to just call the insurance companies directly. And in the end, most of them end up needing to find some sort of agent anyway, because it's really, especially with a language barrier, becomes very difficult, obviously to navigate. But I also wanted to ask you more specifically about catastrophe insurance, because I think that is probably the biggest area that there is no overlap between the Coupa and private insurance. And I know, for myself, or definitely when I speak to people, I'm not allowed to give recommendations. But when I end up giving recommendations, I usually kind of say that if you have supplemental insurance, you probably don't need private insurance, but you should probably look into this catastrophe insurance and perhaps get it. So I just wanted to hear from your end, the details of that, how it really works. If you can give an estimate of cost for something like that. I know it really is hard to say because it varies.
Right. Well, it depends also the definition of how you define catastrophe coverage. Because in my mind, when I hear catastrophe coverage in the sense of health insurance, I'm looking at the medicines not included in the government health basket, the transplants coverage, and the surgeries abroad. That to me is catastrophe. Why? Because that's really where the Kupat Cholim might fall short in the medicine in that coverage. The other element of catastrophe coverage there would be critical illness coverage, right? That's if, God forbid, you're diagnosed with one of up to 42 critical illnesses, and that can vary from company to company. You get a lump sum payout of whatever it's determined. So if it starts at 100,000 shekel or up to 600,000 shekel, you get that money and you do with that whatever it is that you need to do with.
And is that different? Sorry, is that different than the Kupa's long-term care insurance? Because the Kupa has an option to buy in for CUD, which also has a similar structure in terms of the lump sum.
It's different than long-term care because long-term care is determined by your ability to do the 3 out of 6, or your inability to do 3 out of the 6 activities of daily living. Right? So that's walking unaided, sitting and standing unaided, dressing oneself, feeding oneself, using the bathroom, and bathing oneself. Did I miss any? Is that all of them? Did I repeat any?
I think you hit them mostly. If not all.
Or also cognitive impairment. So Alzheimer's, dementia, things like that. Those are the things that would determine someone as a long-term care individual. But that's, first of all, private policies of that nature don't exist anymore. There's only basically about a year and a half ago or so, the insurance companies pulled those policies. They just weren't interested anymore. Anyone who's got those older policies still have them today. You can't buy into any new policy. So what the Kupat Cholim have is very important to sign up for because at the moment that's all there is. And that pays out on a monthly basis. The critical illness coverage serves a different purpose. It's not dependent on your ability to do the activities of daily living, but rather, do you have a diagnosis of X? If yes, then you get paid out a lump sum amount. Now, you can do with that money whatever it is that you want to do. We had a case of a client who called me up after, he was a young guy and he didn't realize, he was having a bit of shortness of breath. And he went to the doctor and the doctor said, all right, let me hook you up to an EKG. They did that, and he's like, all right, go wait in my office. I'll be in soon. And then basically what happened was they ended up calling up an emergency, an ambulance, mobile intensive care, and they rushed him to the hospital. 40-year-old guy, right? Turns out the guy had a heart attack, right? Now, he didn't have a heart attack in the Hollywood sense of grabbing his chest.
Right. Most people don't, right? Yeah.
But he went to the doctor, and in the end, he ended up in the ER with a stent put in. Now, they went back to the doctor, and the doctor was like, look, it says here that you had a myocardial infarction. You had a heart attack. It's going to increase your premiums in the future for your regular policies. So the client called me up in a panic, and they said, listen, are my premiums going to go up now because I had this? I said, not on your older policies, but possibly on your new policies. But 1 second, send me the paperwork because we did a critical illness policy for you about 5 years ago. They sent me the paperwork. Within 14 days, he had 100,000 shekel in his bank.
Wow.
Right? Now, for this guy, he didn't have that, like I said, he didn't have that typical heart attack. But he had to change his work habits. He had to change his, his meal plan. He had to change his exercise routine. There were changes in life where that 100,000 shekel just made that breathing room a lot more accessible. Right. And take a kid, for example, who's got a critical illness, God forbid. I know that if, God forbid, one of my children, me and my wife would be by their side 24/7. Right. Which means cutting back on hours, which means that we're not as productive at work, which means that we are not spending time with our families, which means that we're bringing in caregivers potentially as well. That's another element of breathing room. So that's a catastrophic coverage that I think is essential and is very important for those who don't have that accessible funds, right? Right. If you do obviously have people that have funds that they know that they've got the support of family or investments or trust funds or whatever it might be that they can tap into. So in those scenarios, maybe that 100,000 shekel won't do much for them. Right. For the people who don't, that's where it's super important.
And that's totally separate, you said, from the long-term care coverage for the Kupa. Like, those have nothing to do with each other.
Completely separate policy. It's a policy in its own right. And it's something that anyone can sign up for. There are, maximum entry levels. It's a term policy, so it's up until age 75 or so.
Yeah.
But at a certain point, you decide whether or not you still need it, how much you need, different variations, much like the consideration of a life insurance policy.
Right.
When do I need it? How much do I need it? Et cetera, et cetera. But at the end of the day, this is something that is completely separate from long-term care, because long-term care is a specific role. That specific role is paying for a caregiver or a nursing home if you are in a long-term care state. Whereas this is if you have a critical illness diagnosis, it's cash in hand that you can do with that. You could buy a yacht with it if you want to. Disneyland, you could do it.
Probably not recommended, just to be clear to anyone watching. Don't go take your insurance money and buy a yacht. But
the point is that it's supposed to relieve financial burden, but you can do with that money whatever it is that you want.
Right. Okay, that's really actually interesting. I totally didn't know that at all, so that's good to know. In terms of pre-existing conditions, I really want to go back to it because I talk about pre-existing conditions a lot because it is something that, again, from the Kupa's end, I think that we're incredibly fortunate to live in a healthcare system that, is quite generous in what it offers people and doesn't deny for pre-existing conditions. I say that especially as someone who grew up in a country where that was not the case. Yeah. So it's a really big deal. And I always like to just add that because, I'm one of the first people who can probably find criticism within the healthcare system, but the fact is we have a great system that doesn't deny for pre-existing conditions. Right. And I think the extent to which people don't believe me when I say that private insurance will deny for pre-existing conditions. So I don't know if you can flesh out a little more what that means, because from my understanding, I've heard of cases where if someone one time went for, a scan of their back, it's like, that's it, back's out of the picture. And if you ever need anything with your back, it doesn't matter. I know that sometimes you as an agent, can sometimes there's a little wiggle room. But people come to us all the time and they're like, what does that mean? They'll deny for any pre-existing condition. And I said, it's within a private insurance company's right to deny for any pre-existing condition, and that's up to them. So really, what extent does that go? How serious is that,
So, first of all, it exists. Pre-existing conditions and underwriting according to pre-existing conditions, it's there. The insurance companies don't want to take a risk because at the end of the day, they're a company. Right? They're not the same as the Kupat Cholim. They're a private company who are trying to give you a broader coverage. Right. If you have a clean bill of health, then fantastic, because anything that develops in the future won't be considered a pre-existing condition so long as you've signed on beforehand. But any existing condition, the biggest issue that I find exists with this that a lot of people have trouble with is what is the definition of a pre-existing condition and how far back do I have to go? Right. Now, as far as the insurance companies are concerned, it comes down to their questionnaires. A lot of the times the questionnaires say, have you ever been diagnosed with, or have you ever suffered from? Some of them just leave it at diagnosed with. Right. Some of them include, have you ever suffered from? Right.
Right. If I write on the form, I had a headache once, does that mean that I'm out and I can never,
Obviously, no, but if you have, let's say, chronic migraines, yes. Right. Because the questions are there to be asked, obviously not to exclude everybody and everything. Right. To get a sense as to who they're insuring. Now, number one, what is a pre-existing condition? Obviously, you have to look at what it is that you've had and determine whether or not it's going to affect you in the future. So if I had a tonsillectomy when I was 3, I'm not so concerned about it in my adult life, right? If a 65-year-old woman had a cesarean section for one of her pregnancies, one of the births, it's not something that she should necessarily be concerned with in the future of underwriting, right? That said as well, if there are pre-existing conditions, let's say for cholesterol or thyroid, which are very common pre-existing conditions, right? More often than not, the medicines are going to be covered by the government health basket in any case. Right. Those are already subsidized. So if there's an exclusion of those on on the medicines coverage, then it doesn't really affect your policy in the day-to-day. That's not a reason not to take out a policy. Right.
I guess people just feel a little bit with that is that if people want that extra security for the thing that they're most concerned about, right? So obviously, yes, if you're, diabetes, I think is a big one because I know it's really, really hard to get covered for things for diabetes, for private insurance, travel insurance, all that stuff. But let's say diabetes, obviously through the Coupa, you're going to get covered, you're going to get your insulin, you're going to get any medication you need. But if someone's a diabetic, that's the thing that they're most worried about of what if this goes to something else, which I guess is the same thing you're worried about at the private insurance agencies. So I know a lot of people kind of feel like, well, if my chief concern is not going to be covered, then why do I need this? Which I guess goes back to all the other reasons you said earlier. But
well, it's not just the biggest issue. And my response to those types of concerns, which are justified concerns, because I'm worried about X, and now X is not going to be covered, right?
Right.
That doesn't mean that the rest of the alphabet won't occur, right? Which means that to say I don't want to take your private policy because diabetes isn't covered or because my back issue won't be covered, that doesn't mean, God forbid, that there won't be a neurological issue, an issue of cancer, a heart issue, or any of the other issues that may exist, that there are thousands of different illnesses that would be covered by the policy. But in the moment, a lot of people get frustrated by the underwriting of that one specific thing and then determine whether or not they're willing to take out the policy altogether. Now, because of the rest of the alphabet, as I put it before, it's important to make sure that the declaration is a full declaration, because the thing that can frustrate people even more than the underwriting process is, let's say you had a back issue. Again, we had a client who had a situation like this where they had a back surgery 15 years before they applied for health insurance. And they said, I don't want to declare it. I said, listen, it's not possible not to declare it. It needs to be declared. It's an existing issue. And they were like, no, I don't want to declare it. I'm not interested in having that excluded. I said, let's assume for a second that it's not included and we don't declare it. And there's no exclusion. That's all well and good. But in the event of a claim, the insurance company is going to look at the medical information.
Right.
And the insurance company is then going to look at the doctor's report. Now, more often than not, people will not leave out critical information like that from the policy to the doctor. So the doctor writes in their report history of back surgery or back issues from 19, whatever it was, right? And then the insurance company gets the application for the claim and denies the claim. But it wasn't excluded. You're right, it wasn't excluded, but it was a pre-existing condition.
Right.
So we'd rather be in a situation where the insurance company is fully aware of the whole scenario than the individual being in a situation where they're expecting a claim to be paid out, but it turns out that it's a pre-existing condition.
Right.
So it's often a catch-22 for the individual, because do I mention it? Don't I mention it? What will happen? At the end of the day, we need to make sure as a reputable agency that the health declaration is filled out completely and honestly.
Right.
Because we see it from the implication of for the client and the underwriting, the insurance company, and also for the client in terms of the paying out of a claim, right? We want the client to get their money back. We want a claim to be paid out. That's the intention. That's the point of the business. So therefore, we want to eliminate any hurdles that might get there. So my answer to pre-existing conditions is understand what it is in the whole scope of your application. Understand that we're lucky enough to have a solution through the public system.
Right.
And then weigh up your assessment as to whether or not it's still worth it. Because if something is excluded, it doesn't mean that the premium is necessarily going to go down. So if you have 10 different illnesses that are now excluded, then yeah, maybe your consideration is going to be it's not worth a private policy. But if your consideration is, all right, I've been excluded for cholesterol, and the only real exclusion for cholesterol could really be on medicines coverage, because there's no surgery for cholesterol and there's no transplant for cholesterol, et cetera, et cetera.
But it doesn't extend further. Like if someone has high cholesterol and then it leads to something, do they then, weave that into a pre-existing condition? They
can try, but that's why, at least what we do is we try and specify exactly what the exclusion is. So if it's too broad of an exclusion, we will ask them to be more specific. Okay. Yeah. But at the end of the day, if they've excluded cholesterol, that's not excluding a heart, right?
Right.
Unless they specify that they've excluded the heart. Now, where can that occur? So where have we seen that? Diabetes, for example, can lead to an exclusion of a kidney transplant.
Right.
Okay, and that might be justified because there is a correlation. But cholesterol does not automatically equal heart attack. Right? Or heart issue.
Right.
And it's a matter of understanding that as well, because if you look at that, then it comes down to what the underwriting is. If it's on the medicines, it's on the medicines. And if someone had a heart transplant, then there's going to be an exclusion on the heart, and there's going to be an exclusion on the on everything related to the heart. That makes sense. But there has to be a significant correlation between the two things that are, or whatever it is, being excluded.
Right. I guess just when you're talking about those correlations, and I don't know, Suli, you mentioned diabetes and other heart things. Those are just things that come up on our end a lot. And I guess I'll ask you about this, and then we'll probably, wrap it at end, because I mean, this has been great, but everyone has their things. I guess I want to just ask you, and I this is a tough one for COVID specifically. So I guess maybe we can put that to the side and pretend that that COVID isn't completely taking over all of our lives for the next God knows how long. But particularly when we have people that are either older or diabetes, or even honestly, for myself, who is fairly young and fairly healthy, traveler's insurance that's like a real toughie. And it's really complicated. I know, whether it's traveling abroad, whether I know we have the issue of Toshavim Chozrim, if Bitur Leumi does reject them, from waiving the 6-month fee, those types of things. I know that pretty much anyone who's ever come to us that has diabetes has been basically rejected for any traveler's insurance. So kind of, I guess the question is what do you have any suggestions or options or something like that? Do you know of any insurance that might cover that? And also, really, what's the difference between me calling the Kupa and getting traveler's insurance and me calling you and getting traveler's insurance?
Okay, so there's a lot of questions there.
Yeah, sorry, a lot of stuff in there.
Okay, so COVID aside.
Yeah, please God, yeah, let's hope.
Any pre-existing condition that it would, the travel insurance policies, they look at what pre-existing conditions are going to be relevant and which ones aren't. So again, let's take the example of cholesterol. There's never really an emergency on travel insurance relating to cholesterol. It's never anyone saying, oh, I'm having a cholesterol attack. It doesn't happen, right? You either take medication for it, and you should always make sure you take enough medication and then some for the trip, because the policy will not cover the medication that you forgot to bring with you.
Yes.
Right? And then that will be extra, especially if you're traveling in the States. It'll be astronomical costing. So just be aware of that as a side note. But things like that, the insurance company may not relate to. They may not ask for any increased premiums or anything like that. Things that are more advanced, epilepsy, diabetes, Crohn's, things like that, there they have underwriting. And there, it depends on the severity of the condition, will they determine whether or not they're willing to insure you. So for the most part, they ask, do you take a medication? There are 3 or 4 standard questions. Are you currently taking any medication on a regular basis? Have you been hospitalized in the past 3 to 6 months, depending on the company? And has your health deteriorated over the course of the past 3 to 6 months? Okay, those are the standard questions that they ask. And then based on those answers, they then decide whether or not there needs to be underwriting. So if someone's been hospitalized, they'll ask for the medical documentation. If someone's taking medication, there's a list. There's a standard list. Does the medication apply to A, B, C, D, E, F, G, right? If yes, the underwriting is X amount, extra $2 a day, $4 a day, $20 a day.
Right.
Is it outside of the list? Yes. Okay. Here, give me the paperwork. We'll determine how severe your condition is, and then we'll see. So diabetes, if it's type 1, type 2 diabetes, insulin dependent or not, et cetera, those are the things that might determine whether or not the insurance company will be willing to accept. And that's where, at the end of the day, we turn to a number of different insurance companies when we find somebody who's got a significant pre-existing condition, because we had a client who had epilepsy and was hospitalized in the 3 months prior to travel. One insurance company just flat out declined and said, in a week before you travel, you can try again, but in the meantime, it's declined. Another insurance company said, yeah, sure, no problem, but an extra $20 a day or something like that, right?
Right.
And then it's up to the discretion of the individuals to which one they want to go for. Do they want to take that chance, or do they want to pay the extra $20 a day? Because all of a sudden your trip becomes that much more expensive.
Right.
So that's a really important thing to consider, of working with somebody who will be able to check the options for you. Now, you asked about the Kupat Cholim versus working with an agent. Generally speaking, at least the way we work, the Kupat Cholim, there's a misconception that the Kupat Cholim, if you're buying the policy through the Kupat Cholim, they know all of your pre-existing conditions.
Yeah, no, that's like a huge misconception. People think, first of all, I'm going to put it out there, your Kupat does not cover you when you leave the country. So if you are leaving this country, get travel insurance. People think that it's like an all-inclusive thing. Second, you get on that plane out of this country, your Kupat will basically have nothing to do with you. And also, yeah, you're right that, and I should clarify that when you go to your Kupat for travel insurance, they're in effect outsourcing it to a private company. It's just, I guess the convenience of it is that in the past they used to get better deals. I'm not sure if that's true anymore. And also that it kind of just like comes off of your regular bill every month, and it's not a separate thing to think about, and people think that it's easier from that perspective. But yeah, it's definitely not this like simple thing through your Kupat that they know everything about you. And yeah.
Right. As in, you have to declare, and it's not something where you can say, well, just tap into my file, because the private company is not connected to the Kupat Cholim. Like you said, they've just got a partnership. But even more so, I think, by the way, the misconception that the Kupat Cholim will cover you abroad comes from the American style policies, where you're covered anywhere in the world, as opposed to just in the States, where in Israel it's just within Israel. But in any case, that's number one, that it's a misconception that the Kupat Cholim, doing it through the Kupat Cholim, they'll know everything about your medical history.
Right.
Number two is that, at least currently, the private policies through the Kupat Cholim, as in the travel policies, may not be as comprehensive as a privately purchased one. So there are companies that are going to have broader coverage than others, without limits of liability. Some might have $5 million limit of liability. Some might have more, some might have less. But at the end of the day, it's a matter of understanding that you've got different types of policies, price comparisons, levels of coverage, and working with an agent versus working with the Kupat Cholim is that if there's a claim, and this is also true if you choose to do it through the direct insurers, AIG, Bituach Yashir, or whatever it might be. When there's a claim, it's you versus them ultimately.
Right.
When you're working with an agent, doesn't matter who the agent is, right? The idea is that hopefully that agent will support you as the client and battle it out with the insurance company if it's a justified claim.
Right.
And when we do the policy through Goldfuss, we ask the questions, and we're very thorough about the questions that we ask, because again, we'd rather be in a situation where the insurance company knows all and the underwriting is there, so that if you're hospitalized, you have the coverage and there's no decline of a claim, as opposed to leaving out crucial information just for the sake of getting a travel policy and being able to leave.
Right.
So, a lot of the times people say, and I think the problem is like, oh, I'm just traveling for a couple of days or a week, and how much can it already cover me for? It's just $2 a day or whatever it's going to be, right? Which now, by the way, the prices are probably going to go up because of COVID.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
But the point is that it's a very important one, because in the event of a claim, it can lead to hundreds of thousands of millions of dollars payout potentially, especially if you're traveling to North America, where those expenses can get through the roof. So I mean, definitely,
I think that I know I'm not allowed to recommend, but this I definitely I insist like everyone travel with traveler's insurance, even if it costs a little extra money. People, like you said, they take it very lightly and they think it's not necessarily a huge deal. Or I know a bunch of people who were traveling and they reached out to me just in general about like health insurance, and they said, oh, we got this plan and it covers up to $500,000, and they were going to North America, and I was like, specifically the United States, Canada, you probably wouldn't have that problem, but they were going to the US, and I said to them, I'm like, that's not a large enough policy to travel to the US. Like, if you end up in the US, and ER and need a few days hospital for whatever thing, I'm like, there's your $500,000. Like that's gone. That's not. So, it's definitely important to have good private insurance for traveling.
And that's just it. That it's one of those things where you can never know what's going to be. The whole point of insurance is to cover the unexpected. But people complain a lot of the times about the high cost, especially if you have a pre-existing condition.
Right.
I'm going to reference the Australian government here because it's an awesome line. But basically, when I got my Australian passport, it came with a little pamphlet about smart traveling and buying travel insurance. Mm-hmm. The opening line of that was, if you can't afford travel insurance, you can't afford to travel.
Right. Right.
At the end of the day, the travel insurance should be a small cost compared to the cost of the travel.
Right.
But it's true, if you don't have travel insurance and there is an emergency, you can find yourself in much more financial trouble than you were before, saving those couple of dollars as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess just to if we can conclude a couple of points, if anyone just skips to the end here, basically, I think, both of us from both our perspectives, I would say agree that, everything with insurance is cost benefit analysis, but I mean, you can correct me, but I think we both agree that this is an area where, you might want to focus and might want to consider budgeting. I know even for supplemental insurance, people say, oh, it costs a little bit of money. Do I really need it? But again, that's what insurance is. It costs a little bit of money, but when you need it and you use it, and I think also for supplemental insurance and private insurance, there are things, and I guess for private insurance, they can speak to an agent. Obviously, for supplemental insurance, come ask us. But there are things that you can make use of day to day that will make it feel more worth it to you. Like, it's not only these large emergent events. That's obviously, where the investment is, so to speak. But there are tons and tons of great benefits, and it's definitely something to consider.
And just one more point on that is that, at least the way we work, is that it's not a matter of selling a policy for the sake of selling a policy. Here's a package, take it, buy it, right?
Right.
The most important thing is to be able to have an open conversation and say, okay, here are my needs, here are my concerns, here is what I need to make sure is covered. Can we build a policy according to that?
Yeah.
The other conversation might be, here is my budget. What coverage fits into that?
Right.
That's a conversation you should be having with your insurance agent.
For sure.
To make sure that you understand what you're buying, that you don't feel like you're buying and paying for nothing or for nonsense or whatever it might be. But it should be an open dialogue to make sure that everybody's on the same page and that you understand and accept what it is that you're signing into, because that's where I think a lot of the frustration comes in as well. It's managing the expectations of what the policies can do, but also the conversation about need. What is it that I actually need, and customizing it according to that.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, amazing. Well, thank you so much for joining me and having this conversation.
Thank you.
I know we're here for anything Kupat Holim related. I know, you give yourself a shout out. You guys are there for anything private insurance related.
Yep, absolutely.
And I'm happy to continue this another time, but in the meantime, I guess we'll leave it here.
Yeah, no worries. Sounds good.
All right, great. Thank you so much.
Have
a good night.